Every 4 years, whether you like it or not, game developers trip all over themselves trying to capitalize on the US presidential election. They'll rush out one boring simulator after another based around maps, graphs, charts, and number crunching. For 2020, ExceptioNULL Games has decided to go a different direction. Their new game, Election Year Knockout, attempts to marry Mike Tyson's Punch-Out with political satire. That's not a bad idea, but after socking cartoony versions of Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, I'm convinced that the developers are a little confused about how politics work in the United States. Election Year Knockout tells the outlandish story of how an unknown pugilist and the ghost of John McCain team up to create a new party and challenge politicians to a series of one-on-one fights in the boxing ring of their choosing. This means that they'll not only be taking on primary contenders like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden, but also Republicans like Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, and Dan Crenshaw, who is mostly known for wearing an eye patch and getting into a fight with Pete Davidson. All this is an attempt to shore up the votes he'll need in order to knock out the current resident living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I'll dig into the story and political satire a little later. Let's first talk about the boxing. As I mentioned at the start, this is what I would call a Punch-Out clone. It's the kind of boxing game where the opponent towers over our puny candidate, forcing us to use our limited jabs and hooks to win the day. The good news is that every politician has their own style and patterns, so a lot of the game comes down to dodging back and forth while waiting for an opening. Once you've mastered their predictable patterns, you'll quickly knock them out and move on to the next part of the country. There's nothing really new or inventive about this type of gameplay, but the formula still works. It's fun figuring out all the different patterns, especially when there's so many wacky characters in the mix. For example, the Elizabeth Warren parody sees her firing boxing glove arrows at our hero, while Ted Cruz fights back using weird supernatural powers. Best of all, a lot of the opponents will change their patterns halfway through the fight, forcing us to memorize a whole new set of attacks. Now, it's important to remember the Election Year Knockout costs $20. That's a bit steep for what amounts to a Punch-Out clone, even a solid one. The limited moves and opponents means that you're probably going to beat the game in a single sitting, usually without much of a hassle. This is an easy and repetitive game that relies on its comedy to push it over the finish line. Unfortunately, that means that we're gonna need to talk about the comedy. As political satire, Election Year Knockout is incompetent. The jabs and barbs are so off base that I'm convinced that this was designed by somebody who has absolutely no understanding of American politics. Sure, they know some of the players and heard a few late-night jokes about them, but that's about as deep as the satire gets. It's the kind of game that wants to be edgy and biting, but is ultimately toothless and, worse, clueless. A good example of this is when our third-party hero takes on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a New York City Democrat who surprised everybody by beating a longtime incumbent and becoming the youngest woman ever to serve in the United States Congress. So, given this information, why does Election Year Knockout insist that she's a Republican? And what does knocking out AOC have to do with becoming president? Not only is she not running this year, but she can't even if she wanted to. She's too young. Which is just like our hero, who is clearly not over the age of 35. Okay, you have to understand, a big problem with the comedy is that most of it feels really dated at this point. The jokes being made aren't just a few months old, but in most cases, they're 4 years old. We start the game by beating up Jeb Bush, who's barely been in the spotlight since he dropped out of the primaries 4 years ago. And speaking of 2016, Ted Cruz shows up with supernatural powers for some reason. Even more confusing is why they have the Texan fighting for Alaska, especially when you later go to Canada. Oh, the joke should have written itself. Over on the other side of the aisle, we see very few of the 2020 primary candidates show up in election year knockout. There's not even a single nod to Michael Bloomberg, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, Andrew Yang, or even Mayor Pete. These were some of the biggest newsmakers during the 2020 election, but you would never know it based on this game. Even Bernie Sanders is ultimately upstaged by the bird that interrupted him back in 2016. 4 years ago. Look, this may seem petty, but if you're gonna sell us political satire, then you need to know what you're talking about. The jokes don't land because they don't make sense. This isn't biting commentary, but rather a developer showing us that they don't have the faintest idea what's going on in the 2020 election. Considering how crazy this election has been, you would think that the jokes might write themselves. Unfortunately, the developers of Election Year Knockout wouldn't know political satire if it punched them in the face. Election Year Knockout is the most 2016 game you can play in 2020. With 4-year-old jokes that center around the last election, this Punch-Out clone has no interest in being biting or relevant. It's fun memorizing enemy patterns and traveling around the country winning over voters, but the shallow gameplay in easy difficulty gets old after only an hour or two. Punch-Out fans will find Election Year Knockout too shallow, and political junkies will be baffled by the off-base and outdated jokes. Who is this game for? Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now here's the question I have for you. Have you ever played an election game? I'm always a little curious if people actually play these games and what they get out of them. Seems like they have such a short shelf life, too. Well, let me know in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a review of Rogue Legacy 2, as well as... Are there other games besides Rogue Legacy 2 right now? Gotta answer that. Because instead what I want you to do is click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Till then.